Paris, I think we can let everyone in. Welcome, everyone. We'll just take a few moments here to allow your audios to connect, and then we'll get started with the introductions. Thanks. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of CanCOVID Speaker Series. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Rosa Stalteri, and I lead the research and evaluations team here at CanCOVID. And I do have the pleasure of introducing you to this week's speaker, Pablo Navarro, who is a senior research officer at the Newfoundland and Labrador Center for Applied Health Research. And our title for today is Anticipating and Responding to Knowledge Translation Needs During the Pandemic. So just a few items to note before we get started. We did save time at the end of this presentation for a Q&A session. So please don't be shy, enter in your questions into the events chat, and I'll be happy to relay your questions to our speaker today. And just ensure that you do select to everyone when sending in your question. And we, as always, we do have a little brief announcement at the end that we will share. So without further ado, welcome, Pablo.
Hello, thank you very much for that. Shall we just get right into it? I think we shall.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I just need to begin with land acknowledgement, and that we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit of this province. Quick overview to the talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to this place and where we were at just before the pandemic. Then I'm going to talk about something that we produce called quick response reports. I'm going to follow that with an e-bulletin. I'm going to talk about a second product that we produce called an e-bulletin, and then just close up with some lessons learned from our experience. So some background, which I think is actually kind of useful because Newfoundland and Labrador is really a little bit different than a lot of the provinces. In fact, most of the provinces in the country. It's somewhere between a territory and a province in terms of its geography and its demographics. You'll notice that it is slightly smaller than the size of London, Ontario. It's highly concentrated in the eastern portion on the Avalon Peninsula, which is where St. John's is. That's where I'm speaking to you from. And yet 77% of the communities of the province have less than 1,000 people. It's an older province with a predictably poor health status overall at the population level. The health system itself is, and I think this bears mentioning, somewhat chastened by some past scandals. You might remember the Cameron inquiry. And so it's quite risk averse, and it's quite under pressure at the moment because of its cost inefficiencies. And that is part of a larger picture that the province is in the midst of an economic outlook, which is extremely precarious. Now, while I have no real evidence to back this up, my own feeling from the pandemic is that there is a cultural memory here that still exists and lingers for massive disease outbreaks and possibly for mass casualties that resulted from it as well. And I think that might be the result of things like tuberculosis having lasted here longer than most parts of the provinces, although in some ways almost as long as some parts of the territories. Now, a little bit more background to explain where I'm coming from. I'm a senior research officer at a center in a university. And the main thing that I work on is called CRISP, CHRSP. That's for Contextualized Health Research Synthesis Program. It's an integrated KT initiative that's been going since 2007. And as a result, we have quite trusting and established relationships with the very senior leadership of the health system. That's the CEOs of the regional health authorities and the deputy ministers of the government departments with a mandate in health, as well as senior administrators within the health system who have played or do play a role as CRISP champions and help us do this integrated KT initiative. The KT people, the people in CRISP where I work, we're not topic specialists, we're topic generalists. What we are is KT specialists. And so we tend to be fairly adaptive when it comes to taking on new topics. So in the initial phase of the pandemic, what was happening here was that we at the center, we were quite certain that we were going to experience a local impact, and we started to get prepared for it. Things like making sure that we could all work from home, we could continue our work, etc. And of course, everybody was watching this map that Johns Hopkins was putting out, and you could see, the growth in cases in Spain and in Italy as it escaped China. We were pretty certain it was going to come to North America. And we also had some sense that the knowledge users that we work with in our integrated KT initiative were going to be facing a bunch of unknowns, lack of preparation, despite the fact that after the first SARS outbreak, there was all these efforts to try to maintain preparation and lots of KT needs. We knew that it would be a stressful time, and so facilitating KT would be really important. And where we did have regular communications with people in the healthcare system, it wasn't out of place for them to reach out to me in particular and field some informal requests. What did I know about how to deal with the unhoused people in the province in the context of COVID? What were the lessons learned from places like Italy, for instance, in acute care and long-term care settings, where they really had a rough time of it? What should we do about screening health human resources people who are going to hospitals? Does temperature screening work? Questions like that. And we realized very early on that these were the kinds of questions that people in the healthcare system were going to have, and they were looking for help. And so the center where I work, and in particular, the people who work on CRISP, we pivoted to providing some form of pandemic support for those questions and opening ourselves up to any kinds of topic solicitations that there might be. We call these things quick response reports. So what are they? They're knowledge user driven, which means that the knowledge users are picking the topics. And we fell back on existing communications and relationships that we had established through CRISP in order to get these things into the pipeline. Each one had to have a defined focus and scope, which was usually set through some brief consultations with the knowledge user. And we had some knowledge user considerations, we call them, things that we thought would be really valued on the knowledge user side, and they turned out to be pretty accurate. One of them, of course, was that this was an emerging evidence landscape, so there's lots of volatility and things are going to be changing, and we had to accommodate that in our quick response reports. There were going to be reliability and validity issues because it was an emerging body of evidence, and so things were bound to be changing and require some critical look. Turnaround time had to be fast, and we had to facilitate the knowledge translation as much as possible for the knowledge users that we were working with. And of course, we wanted to play to our own strengths, and one of those was to make use of the CRISP spare capacity that we anticipated, because we assumed that all the projects we were working on, since they're integrated in nature with the healthcare system, were going to be put on hold because the healthcare system people were going to be busy. We developed a structured report format because that makes life easier for both the people who are producing it and the people who are reading it. Each one had a disclaimer, as you would imagine. The original inquiry was always stated as close as possible to literally the question that we were being asked, sometimes on the phone, sometimes by email. We tried to include definitions and concepts where needed, and where this was an emerging topic, those could be very important because people were using different terms to describe similar things. Then we had a summary that the CRISP researchers, the KT people who were writing these, would produce to try to give a very, very basic and extremely brief summary of what we had found in our searches. And then we actually got down to the articles themselves, and we sort of ranked those, or we structured those in such a way that we began with guidance from health authorities, things like World Health Organization, CDC, Public Health Agency of Canada, and then the provincial departments of health and that kind of stuff, because we were pretty sure that the knowledge users we were producing these for were going to be looking to those voices first, but not necessarily able to find them as quickly as we could. Then we had evidence in the form of systematic reviews and other reviews, followed by expert opinion, primary research, which, as I'm sure you all recall, lots of preprints were in the primary research category, and so we always had to flag those. And then some news and science reporting, because if you recall as well, at the time, some of the best information coming out about the pandemic was through news reporting. The individual items themselves all had a sort of similar format so that we could facilitate the knowledge translation as well. We had a source, title, and date. The date part was particularly important for the first 2 months or so of the pandemic, less so afterwards, although still important. We had links to original materials and a bottom line quote from what we could take out of there. We tried to really find the sentences that we thought would be the most important to the knowledge users who had requested this particular topic. We had an appendix of sorts with our methods put in there just for transparency. And initially we had full citations, but we discontinued that because nobody really cared. And we had links to the original materials. We tried to maintain as minimalist a design as possible because we were aware that there was a certain amount of fatigue among our knowledge users. And we tried to have consistency in terms of highlighting critical elements. Now, that would be either things that were cautionary in nature or things that were really key in nature as far as we could tell from what we were looking through. So just to give you some ideas, quick response reports that we were asked to produce came in various sort of fields and areas. At the beginning, there was a lot of stuff about epidemiology and biology, as well as things like health services and health human resources, getting the healthcare system ready for the pandemic. Then we sort of moved into more health system administration type of questions. Things like how do we resume, how do we manage aerosol generating medical procedures, that kind of stuff. Social programs and services were also actually quite predominant throughout the pandemic in terms of our quick response report topics. And then later on, but typically a little bit more later on, there were the questions of well-being and mental health as people realized that there were going to be sort of diffuse impacts throughout. All of our quick response reports were archived on our website. Oh, there we go. Knowledge users tended to give us quite positive responses. Over time, as you can see, there was a decline in need as information and knowledge gaps were filled and lessons learned from other jurisdictions were shared among healthcare systems. The later topics, as I mentioned, tended to be more secondary effects like wellness and mental health, and also some requests for updates because there was interest to see if things had changed over time from the initial quick response report that we had produced. We also realized fairly early on, about 2 or 3 months into the pandemic, that we were going to need, we wanted to meet a different knowledge user need, and that was a news or evidence scan. For that, we designed an e-bulletin, pretty straightforward. This one was researcher driven as opposed to knowledge user driven. We did keep in mind some considerations though. First of all, knowledge users had significant constraints in terms of their time, but also their searching capacity to find the kinds of information that we thought would really help them and that they had sort of communicated to us was helpful every time we found it for them. It was important to curate the information so that there wasn't too much and what we found was directly relevant to what they were doing. We tried to source a broad range of sources for them so that it wasn't the materials that they would probably be looking at all the time anyway from their emails and email lists. And of course, we tried to facilitate the knowledge translation as much as possible to put as little of a demand cognitively on the knowledge users as possible because they were going through and processing so much information day to day. We wanted to play to our strengths again, and that meant making use of our other spare capacity, which is grad students, because we're at a university. Research assistants who we would hire through different kinds of programs who also really didn't have much to do because the whole health system had been geared toward dealing with the pandemic. And the approach that we took was to have open topics within defined categories. Let me show you what those look like. So the structure of, again, the report had a structured format that people would get used to and made it easier for the people who were working on it to, produce the information that we were looking for. We divided it into 6 categories, the current 6 categories, I should say. We had a different system initially and that evolved rather rapidly, and this is more or less stable now. We look at articles that deal with clinical presentation and biology, health equity and ethics, health system administration, infection prevention and control, therapy, well-being, and mental health is the last one. The item format is very similar to what you saw in the QRRs, just source, title, date, and a quote that we think is the sort of bring home message quote. And then all of these things we make sure are links that can be actually followed by our knowledge users. Where we're in a university, we have access to all the publications and they don't necessarily have that information. So here's just an example of what it looks like. Again, we tried to have as minimalist a design as possible and something that was easy on the eyes. People were spending a lot of time in front of their screens like all day long. We tried to combine news reporting with the research articles that we found as much as possible because we found that that really facilitated our knowledge users taking up the research that we were sending their way. We do this through an email. It's a PDF that's attached to the email, and we also have a link to a website copy in case that's ever needed if they lose the original PDF. It's readable on most devices. I think really small cell phones might be a problem, but on iPads or the larger cell phones now that people use, it's pretty readable. We occasionally include notices now when we send out our e-bulletin for things like webinars of this sort. And that has ended up being actually pretty good. I think sending them out too often, they sort of turn into noise and background. But sending these kinds of notices out on occasion ends up being a little bit more effective. The categories, as I mentioned, have evolved over time to better reflect the needs of the knowledge users. And the knowledge users themselves have had really positive reactions to the e-bulletin, a little bit more positive than we expected, to be honest. We've asked them twice now if they would be okay if we stopped doing it, and they told us that they want us to keep on doing it, quite emphatically, as a matter of fact. So we're going to keep on doing it. And the e-bulletins have extended the reach that we anticipated having. We've been told that it gets circulated in New Brunswick, in British Columbia, and possibly other places. So we just actually, in the last issue, put out a survey to ask, among other things, who are you? Who is reading these e-bulletins, and what are you making of it? So just to wrap up, I think I'm close to 20 minutes here. I wanted to mention some of the lessons learned that we have from our experience. In terms of the on-demand knowledge user requests, those are the QRRs, or the quick response reports. We really appreciated how our research center was more responsive in having on-demand knowledge user requests than having some kind of like cyclical approach to taking in topics and then dealing with them. It was context appropriate, we thought, to have that on-demand knowledge user request because there were so many unknowns at the beginning of the pandemic, and people really were just calling us up, at a moment's notice to ask for help. And I think it also helped the health system sort of adapt to those situations that are really in flux, where they were going in one direction at one moment and then realizing that they had to reconsider something or change tack. In terms of the e-bulletin, which is essentially a digest, and I hadn't really appreciated that until fairly recently, because digests are not a new thing. It's just that we've rediscovered them in this particular product. One of the things that we really learned is that it's given us an opportunity to develop a new capacity within the center. So we have 3 grad students on the e-bulletin team. They're listed there below on your screen. And each one of them has stuck with the same categories throughout the whole pandemic. And so now they have a little bit of expertise in that area, and they're able to find stuff really quite quickly and be able to give it some critical appraisal. This digest has also opened the door for us to consider new products for our health system partners, because they really quite like this. And we realize that there are other areas that we might want to consider having a regular bulletin for them. But of course, we'll figure that out through consultations with our knowledge user partners. It was definitely a trust building exercise. And we've learned from previous experience that having trust with knowledge user partners goes a long way to increasing uptake and being more responsive to them. It goes in both directions. And I think also we may have built some new relationships, as there are people within the healthcare system that we hadn't been interacting with particularly a lot previously, who, because of the e-bulletin, feel a stronger connection to us and are more open to asking us for help. I've given you just a few snapshots there of the people who've been working on this for the past almost 2 years now, or coming up rather to 2 years. Those are the people on our staff. Dr. Stephen Bornstein is retired at the moment, but he was director of the center when all of this was being developed and implemented. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Very interesting work and very pertinent to the work that we also do here at CanCOVID, and I'm sure many people that who are in our audience for today. We'll start with our Q&A, just to remind our participants that we're going to be having about a 10-minute Q&A session, so please do enter your questions into the chat box. So we'll start with the first one here. What are the most effective knowledge translation methods you would recommend others use to reach each age group? So, for example, cuirassing, infographics, commercials, ads on social media, etc.
So I should state at the outset that we were really doing KT for our health system partners. We weren't trying to reach for instance, younger or that for that matter, much older age groups. And we were trying to do KT for them in a very specific way where we knew that the most helpful, or we had understood that the most helpful thing for them would be to get a sense of whether or not they should invest the time looking up something in detail. So when we would put out those quick response reports or the e-bulletins, what we're really trying to do is triage as much as possible for the knowledge user, whether or not this is something they want to put their time into reading and understanding. So that's the real goal of our particular tools. Now, with regards to reaching other groups, there's definitely other ways to do it. And those groups, of course, have different motivations and different needs. But I don't think I could speak to that very much in this immediate forum.
And I'm sure the next question here is probably the same answer. The question is, which factors should be considered when creating knowledge translation products in areas where the population's health literacy may be low or where it varies greatly?
So we try very hard. I mean, it's because of the nature of the products that we were putting out over the pandemic. There was very little writing on our part. You know what I mean? Like the summaries had a little bit. But even with our particular audiences, we really strive to have plain language, highly accessible, easy to read materials as much as humanly possible. And that applies to all of the work that we do in CRISP, our integrated KT initiative. But in terms of which factors should be considered, I think talking to your audience is one of the best ways to figure that out, because they will often have a sense of what their own challenges are in terms of materials that have been produced for them that don't really work, because there are various barriers to those materials, whether it's the language that's being used, which could be the case when it comes to health literacy, or even the formats. You know, a more visual representation for something can be in some ways much faster to take up in terms of the information that's being produced than a written document. But again, I would say definitely what you want to do is you want to speak to your knowledge users, and where we've been doing this kind of stuff since 2007 with more or less the same people, we've had lots of opportunities to ask them what works and what doesn't. And just to give you one quick example, one of the things that was very clear from our audience is that they spend all day reading, and they want to see as few words as humanly possible to get to the point about whether or not, to get to the point where they can make a decision about if they want to continue or not, or if they want to know more or not. And so that's what we were trying to do.
Much.
Great questions, by the way. Thank you.
Yes, and there's many more great ones, so we'll try to get through them all. Given the speed at which new info is being generated every day, how do you and your team produce evidence reviews when there is little time to check for quality, or maybe the available evidence may not be as robust as you would like?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and I think it's very, very context dependent. So if you can remember back to the first like 2 or 3 months of the pandemic, let's say from mid-February to, I don't know, let's say mid-April, that 2-month period, it really was an extremely dynamic information kind of landscape. And as you saw, we're a very small office trying to do, the best that we can. We all had our day jobs at the same time as we were doing this to some degree or other. And so we relied on, trust, really. And at the end of the day, that actually, if you get philosophical about it, a lot of scientific merit at some point eventually comes down to some element of trust. And so when we were producing our quick response reports, we tried to take advantage of the capacities of other larger groups than us who had produced materials that we could trust had put in some due diligence in terms of critical appraisal and assessing the reliability and validity of the information that they were putting out. And of course, that doesn't always work. And we've seen that, for instance, you still see foot dragging on I'm not admitting, but stating that COVID-19 is an airborne transmissible disease. We still have a lot of droplet, for instance, infrastructure in our public health measures where the evidence base for that is virtually nil. And yet we don't have, air filtration devices in schools to the degree that the evidence would strongly suggest we should have. So it's not a foolproof way to rely on other authorities, but it was one thing that we did at the very beginning. And we also sort of applied that to the more, I wanted to say more rigorous publications, but the truth is they just had great reputations. So those sort of top tier publications like Nature and Science, the New England Journal of Medicine, and that kind of stuff. If something was coming out of being published in a journal that we'd never heard of before or had a very low impact factor, we tended to put a little bit more time into that. Now, as time has gone by, where we do have a little bit more time to look at things, when we do get a quick response report now, which is actually quite rare, we can dedicate a little bit more time and a little bit more effort to doing your basic critical appraisal. So there are some tools that we are used to using that we can employ, like AmStar for systematic reviews or Downs and Black for different kinds of studies. And there's a whole bunch. But that only comes with the luxury of time. So when time was very tight, we really relied on other organizations and what we knew of them. And I've said all this, I've forgotten to mention there have been all these great networks that have been set up, like Can COVID and COVID End and others with experts who are accessible. And we've also taken advantage of that to ask some experts that we have a relationship with, does this look to you like something that is reportable? So, we were sort of making it up as we were going along. There's a lot of scrambling, but those were the basic strategies we employed.
And this is sort of related to this as well. I'm guessing the answer is no, but do your products report judgments about strength of evidence and certainty of conclusions?
No, not yet. No, what we were really trying to do was get evidence into the hands of knowledge users. And I guess one of the things that I should also mention is that we were in this particular context where we have this pre-existing knowledge translation initiative, we were also available for follow-up. So, all of the knowledge users that we interact with are very aware. It goes without saying now that if they have a question about something in a product that we produce, that they can come back to us, and they do that. They'll come and ask us to give, more detail or, a second look and that kind of stuff.
So we'll try to get through the rest, but here's the next one. What recommendations do you have for a nonprofit or institution that doesn't have access to journals, but conducts literature reviews on an ongoing basis? Are there ways to partner with certain universities within Canada? And this person is based in Ontario.
Right, so that's a very frustrating situation, of course. Here in this province, I can't speak for Ontario, but in Newfoundland and Labrador, the university has a mandate to be a provincial resource, and that has all sorts of implications, especially when it comes to its medical school and the health sciences faculties and divisions. And so here it's actually very feasible for a not-for-profit to have a group library membership. And so that's one of the ways around it. We did not run into significant issues when it came to getting open source articles. I would say somewhere between maybe 3 and 5% of the articles that we found weren't publicly available. And that's probably in part because of the pandemic conditions where people were really good about making their materials available. And also in part because there has been a shift, a noticeable shift in the publishing industry for more open access. And I think you'll see that, more and more. I hope we'll see that more and more. But beyond that, I would strongly recommend speaking to the librarians at the university that's closest to where you are located and seeing what options they have for you, because librarians are like the secret weapon in your arsenal. That's what you want to use.
You can say that again for sure. Can you say a little more about the knowledge users? Who are they and how they got their information requests to you?
So the knowledge users in these two particular products, the knowledge users are people who work in government departments with a mandate in health. And that ranges from directors, deputy ministers, assistant deputy ministers, directors, and policy analysts. Again, this is a small province, so our level of access is much higher than you would necessarily find, I think, in a lot of other provinces, just by virtue of the fact that it's so small. In the regional health authorities, that's the name we give the administrative bodies for the healthcare system in this province. I think they're called LHINs in Ontario, LHINs or something like that. The CEOs all get a copy of our quick response reports in the e-bulletins, along with VPs and senior administrators. There are some directors who have had relationships with us in the past because of previous projects who are on the list as well. And then we decided that we should really extend that list to include a few other groups. For instance, the school board I think it's called the school district here. For the province, we thought it was going to be really important that they be aware of some of these things. So at the very least, we could passively sort of throw these emails at them. We didn't have trusting relationships with them before. I don't know if we have trusting relationships with them now. I hope there's a bit more of a relationship. And again, we could do that because it's a relatively small province. It's not relatively, it's an absolutely small province. And you can just, get in touch with these people. So we were trying to use our small size to our advantage in that respect. Now, somebody was asking, so the question was like, who are they, but not just in terms of positions, but also in terms of like what their function is. So this is a mix of people who have executive roles and people who have policy development roles. And often the latter are being told by the former that they need to know about something. And that's why we would get the quick response report request. In terms of the e-bulletin, we're still learning about who is reading it and what kind of use they're making of it. So for instance, just one thing to mention, one group that I haven't really spoken about are physicians in the province. And we've heard some, and this is just preliminary, but we've heard some information from some physicians that the e-bulletin really doesn't help them because it's not granular enough. They really want like very detailed information as opposed to sort of synthesis type information. And I could see how that might be the case. Different knowledge users are going to have different needs. And our particular audience was really the administrators of the health system more than the service delivery people in the health system. I hope that answers your question.
We are over time, but I did note in our pre-session, Pablo, that we'll take just a couple more minutes to answer the last few questions we have here, which let the participants know that we will just be taking a couple minutes. So can you tell us more about what you feel has led to a high level of trust with your knowledge user partners? What factors or events contributed to this trust, and how can this trust be maintained? Okay, so I think the first thing to mention is time, because it's very hard to find a shortcut to just putting in the time.
But that has definitely had a major impact. I don't know how much of that is a cultural thing, but here it's definitely something to get to know somebody just by virtue of having gone through a bunch of stuff together. Another thing that has really helped, I think, has really helped us develop trusting relationships is that we go back not too frequently, but regularly to our knowledge users and ask for critical feedback. We really do try to be responsive to their needs, and we're also aware of the fact that their needs change. So it's not just that we need to improve our ability to figure out what is responsive, but we also need to adapt to where they're at. So when we started our IKT initiative back in 2007, the idea and the concept of evidence-based medicine was really popular. Evidence-based decision-making was, just becoming all the rage. And it was to a large degree new for a lot of the people here in this province. Now it's not new. Now it's old hat and it's evidence-informed decision-making instead of based. And a lot of the senior knowledge users that we interact with have gone on to do all sorts of kinds of professional development and grad programs even. So we're talking to literally a different audience. And the way we try to keep up with them is by actually communicating with them. Communication is extremely important. And I think that really helps to build trust, in part because they feel very comfortable now, at least I'd like to hope that they feel very comfortable now, telling us that we can do something better, or that we're not doing something that they need us to do any longer, or any of the other sort of negative feedbacks. Now, they know that we're in this for the long haul. And they have a good sense, I think, of our temperaments because we've been doing this together for so long. And of course, when somebody new comes in, their colleagues, will say, oh yeah, we know that guy, Pablo from not originally Newfoundland, obviously with a name like that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that kind of stuff. So, you get brought into the fold pretty quickly. I think one other thing that's really important, and I didn't get a chance to get into this before, but when we do our KT stuff for the health system in normal circumstances, the C in CRISP, which is our program name, is for contextualize. And that's sort of like our bread and butter for our KT, which is to say that we interpret the research evidence in the context of the province, which of course is going to be very different. I mean, this province is very different from where you do most research. If you go to most research settings, it's not like this. And so the interpretation of what the research findings mean for implementation in terms of things like feasibility or acceptability or health equity concerns, for instance, in terms of who's going to be sharing the benefits and harms and how, that's part and parcel of our work. And doing that was largely a response to the health system telling us at the very beginning that it was fine that something has been shown to work. And this was their line, but it won't work here because here's different. And so by contextualizing the research findings and taking into account all the particular idiosyncrasies and differences of the province, I think that made us sound a lot more credible and legitimate. And that helps to foster trust.
Thanks so much. And I think this is a great question to end this session today on. Building on your lessons learned, is there anything you would have done differently from the beginning, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I think, yeah, so I think at the beginning, we were trying to sort of keep up our day jobs as much as possible while we did this off the side of our desk. And I think it would have been better if we had gone all in right off the bat and just said, everything's going to be on hold and we're just going to help you guys, because all the projects we were doing at the health system were effectively put on hold on their end, and they didn't really care if we put it on hold on our end. And I think a lot of the decision maker, I think we could have had quite a higher number of quick response report requests if we had been able to reach more people more effectively. I think in some cases, people were really quite overwhelmed by how much had to get done and so fast. And it was in a context of, if you recall, stress and fear, because it was a great unknown pandemic. And I think being asked, actually reaching out to individuals and asking them, is there anything we can help you with, would have just sort of put it over the top in terms of our ability to penetrate the audience that we were trying to reach. So that's definitely one of the things that I would have liked to have done. And we didn't pay attention early in the bulletin. We didn't pay as much attention to health equity and health ethics as I think we should have, because I think there were a lot of questions there that could have been brought out more. We had a sense that certain topics or categories, as we call them, were going to become more important at different times of the pandemic. But I think that one sort of could have used a little bit more attention, because just even if it wasn't directly relevant to the knowledge users we were writing for or doing these for, having some of those issues in the back of your mind and ruminating on it and thinking about it over longer periods of time, not those split decision, oh, I read this and now I know what I think, but just letting it sit and create part of the background landscape of how you make decisions can be really useful for the health system. And of course, we've seen that sort of play out in all the issues about vaccine mandates and how to manage schools and the benefits and harms of lockdowns for children and all that kind of stuff. There's an ethical component in there, which I think really does inform the discussion and makes for better and more informed decision making. So those are the two big things that I would think of.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Pablo Navarro. I just want to say on behalf of the CanCOVID team, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to you. There were many, many takeaways that I have got from this presentation. I'm sure the audience would agree with me. So thank you so much. Just want to say, please join us for our next week's speaker series. Next week, Tuesday, from 4 to 4:30 Eastern Time, where we will hear from Dr. Oliver Durian, who will present on the epidemiology and outcomes of children with SARS-CoV-2 in Canada. And so that is it for today. This concludes today's event. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you again at our next event. Thanks again, Pablo.
Thank you, everybody.